Welcome back to the class. As you know, we are in the module that looks into the influence of feminist theory and feminist studies on Indian sociology. And yesterday, we had a discussion on the same topic by Sharmila Rege. We looked into the introduction written by her for an edited work which compiled the essays that appeared in Sociological Bulletin, the Journal of Indian Sociological Society. And in that lengthy introductory essay, Sharmila Rege really traces the history of the kind of an association between feminist scholarship and Indian sociology, and the kind of challenges and difficulties that it had to face, and we discussed that. And in today's class as well, we are following the similar line. This is an essay by Aparna Rayaprol, and it's titled Feminist Research, Redefining Methodology in Social Sciences. And this has less to do with the interaction between sociology and feminist theory in India, but rather more of a kind of a theoretical arguments about what does a feminist research means. Okay, what does a feminist research method, epistemology means? What kind of questions can be asked from a kind of a feminist theoretical standpoint, feminist theoretical perspective. And the latter part of the essay also has some reflections of Professor Aparna's own engagement with the field and how she conducted her field work in Pittsburgh, among the Indian diaspora in that place. So yeah. So it's an essay appeared in Contributions to Indian Sociology, as we discussed earlier, one of the most prestigious journals on Indian society, established by Dumont and Pocock, still considered to be one of the very important leading sociology journal. So yeah, in this article I will discuss how feminist perspective is not only possible but also necessary in all social research. It is problematic that sociological research claims to be reflexive while turning its lens on the other, but falls short of questioning on its own social location. And this is something that we have discussed in the yesterday's class, and we are going to discuss the same in the coming class when we discuss an essay by Professor Sujata Patel, where this whole question of the claim of sociology as being a reflective science or as a reflective social sciences is often challenged or further complicated by scholars from different standpoint positions, from different scholarly position, who point out the kind of major omissions and elisions that are become the kind of central feature of the practice of Indian sociology. Feminist methodologies are not outside of the sociological enterprise, but must be seen as a significant part of it. If the sociological method has given analytical rigor to feminist work, it is a feminist perspective that has completely transformed sociological understanding. Research on women's issues has gradually evolved into research that problematized gender, allowing for a more nuanced understanding of systematic marginalization through force of domination, such as patriarchy, colonialism, casteism, and racism. So we had a brief discussion about in the previous class how the gender studies or women's studies rather kind of transformed into a gender studies, and how the kind of concerns about the kind of concerns transformed over times. So this is again an essay which looks into those kind of questions, but focusing more on the kind of theoretical and methodological questions. Origin of feminist methodology. Feminist researchers have argued that, firstly, traditional social theories have often marginalized or rendered insignificant women's life world. In rare cases of inclusion of women's experiences in conceptual schemes, they have been distorted. Secondly, feminist scholars argued that the mainstream social sciences research tended to incorporate gender, or more problematically sex, as only one of the many sociological variables under study. By doing that, gender becomes a mere referential point without assuming centrality. And this is a point I think we have discussed several times. This has been pointed out by almost every feminist worth the salt, who argue that in the initial classical sociological period, as well as subsequently, the social was understood as the domain of the men. Okay, it was seen as the society, the social was seen as the domain of the men, and they did not it did not even occur to them that women as an important or equal representative or equal partner in this whole affairs need to be acknowledged and then studied significantly. So even that realization was not available. So in have been marginalized or rendered insignificant women's life world. In rare cases of inclusion of women's experience in conceptual scheme, they have been distorted. Secondly, feminist scholars argued that the mainstream social science research tended to incorporate gender, or more problematically sex, as only one of the many sociological variables under study. So you know that in the typical social science research, you ask a lot of you will put a lot of variables. For example, ethnicity, nationality, caste, religion, age group, education, health standard. So these are all the variables using which you come to kind of a conclusions about certain social phenomenon. So gender was also seen as just yet another category, okay, which provides you with certain kind of understanding about the population, without really problematizing this or without really incorporating much larger, very insightful, ideas about insightful ideas that could have been gained by keeping gender as a very important central category, as an explanatory category. Women scholars too have for a long time been absorbed by the dominant rules of sociological method and have not been exceptional in their approach to study of research, theory and research. So we are looking into that. Now she in the following section, what she does, she elaborates this Sandra Harding's very important arguments about standpoint theory, and we will engage with that more elaborately when we in the coming weeks, where we look into a very interesting debate between Sundar Saruke and Gopal Guru, and we will also have an essay by Sharmila Dage, where she talks about Dalit feminist standpoint theory. So the standpoint theory is something very important. It has been considered to be one of the very important intervention in the recent methodological methodological debates. So we in the subsequent sections, she invokes Sandra Harding's and then tries to elaborate what exactly is the feminist methodological perspectives. So feminist sociology insists on the central analytical category of gender, without which key concerns in the sociology disciplines such as work, politics, education and religion cannot be studied satisfactorily. So this is a very important concern. It is not that when you study religion or when you study state or when you study politics or when you study education, you also look into gender. Okay, it does not work in that way, or that's not how gender must be studied. On the other side, on the other way, you need to look at these things through the perspective of gender. Then this very phenomenon itself might appear very differently. Or in other words, gender has the ability to offer explanatory paradigms. Gender has the ability to offer different perspectives about this, about the domain which you are going to study. So an absence of a gender perspective would certainly provide you with only a limited understanding of the substance or the theme that you are going to study. So that is a very different claim. Okay, that's a very different claim. You are not trying to understand how gender, how you need to incorporate gender in the analysis of a substantive theme, but rather taking up perspective of gender to analyze a larger theme would be much more productive, much more important. Clues to unraveling this relationship between feminism and sociology can be found in Feminist Sociology of Knowledge. Sandra Harding's Typology of Feminist Epistemologies is a good starting point. She delineates three distinct epistemological positions. One is feminist empiricism, second is feminist standpoint theory, and third is feminist postmodernism. So we are going to discuss these three things in more detail. That's what Aparna has written in this section. So we may not go in detail to the latter last part of this essay, because that is more of Aparna's own reflections about her PhD days and how she had to look at this in a specific sociological context. Now, feminist empiricism identifies androcentrism and sexism as social biases which needs to be corrected by stricter adherence to rules of scientific inquiry. This is a very important argument, that it comes from the basic realization that all social sciences has been androcentric. Okay, it's all revolved around men. Okay, it is all produced by men, it is for men, it is about men, and that needs to be corrected. Okay, and how that needs to be corrected, because there is a male bias in the discipline, and this bias needs to be challenged, and that can be challenged by following a very strict scientific inquiry. Okay, the rules of strict scientific inquiry. This is the kind of an initial premise of the feminist empiricism, that you need to look at the empirical world, which is also constituted by female, by women, and by non-male entities, and that has not been adequately addressed or understood, but that has to be understood, that has to be taken into account. Harding points out that feminist empiricists work from the basic principle that both sexes have contributed to the evolution of our species. So there is a call for inclusion of women as both the researchers and both the researched and the researcher. Now, this we can say that maybe this emerges immediately after the beginning of the emergence of classical sociological theory, say from 1900 onwards, or 1910 and 1920 onwards. This kind of a realization emerges that the classical theory has been a fiefdom of males, and it is produced by males, and it is about them. It is even oblivious to the existence of non-male categories or genders or other categories. So this empiricism, the feminist empiricism, asks for a corrective step by providing equal focus or adequate focus to the voices as well as inclusion of women out there, both as the researched as well as the researcher. So it calls for increasing number of women researchers, and it also calls for increasing focus on women subjects. This kind of research sought to generate good science, which by definition is not gender blind. Okay, it involves adding women to existing research agendas and giving recognition to them in their respective field. The point that we discussed. Now, this perspective is critical of the dominant mode of scientific inquiry for neglecting gender and women's concerns, and suggests that this bias could be corrected by more rigorous empirical research. The point that we discussed, that they believed that a true research, an authentic scientific research should be able to overcome all these kind of biases. And again, this bias is a very, very innocent term. Okay, it tells you that either consciously or unconsciously, certain section of things have been overlooked. Okay, so now they want more of a rigorous scientific approach that would naturally will overcome this kind of a bias. So sex and later gender as variable. The studies in social stratification, for example, intergenerational mobility, which was originally measured by examining fathers and occupational profiles, changed to include women, family, racial, and immigrant profiles as well. However, this work resulted often only in correcting facts rather than providing a deeper understanding of the real reasons for gender inequality. So again, as you know, that the agenda of this particular feminist empiricism is very limited. It wants to look into women's issue, or it wants more women also to be part of the research. So it ends there. Okay, it does not have more ambitious or more adventurous or more larger claims about changing the very way in which the discipline itself is constituted. That those kinds of promises or those kinds of arguments are simply absent. The Commission on Status of Women in India was set up to understand women's status in education, health, and other social parameters. Yeah, so it talks about how this kind of got translated in India, where more commissions and then more official attention was paid to the questions of women and other non-male genders. Second, more important and more promising framework is what is understood as feminist standpoint theory. Okay, and this, as I mentioned, this standpoint theory is a very, very important intervention in the methodological debates, which we will take it up very extensively. So, standpoint feminists argue that the theoretical perspectives offered by them and the methods they use to analyze society are from the perspective of the subjugated gender. Okay, they are different from the feminist empiricists because for them knowledge is grounded in experience. The standpoint perspective dominated gender-centric sociological research in many parts of the world. Now, what is the standpoint? Feminist standpoint theory argues. Feminist standpoint theory argues that the mere mechanical inclusion of women into your research is not sufficient. Okay, for example, if you are conducting a study on poverty, uh, you conduct survey among 10 males, and then in order to balance that you conduct survey among 10 women, then that is not sufficient enough. Okay, according to the feminist empiricism, that would have been sufficient because you give equal importance to both the genders. But feminist standpoint theory argue that it is different, because how the poverty is experienced, and how poverty impinges on the lives of these women are very, very different from how poverty is experienced by men and how poverty impinges on the lives of the men. Okay, because women, because of their experiences are different, okay, either as working women or non-working women, working who are women who are confined to their domestic sphere, or women who have to balance both domestic as well as public sphere, their very experience can be very different, and this experience is something central to the theorization of social theory. So standpoint theory focuses on the experiences of different section of people, the lived experience of different section of people, and how this lived experience could be very different even within a seemingly singular category. Okay, for example, women or Dalit or black people, how they, first of all, they constitute a different kind of standpoint, but within their own standpoint there could be further different points. A sociology of women preserves the presence of subjects as knowers and actors. It does not transform subjects into objects of study or make use of the conceptual devices of eliminating the active presence of the subjects. Its method and analytical procedures seek to preserve the presence of the active and experiencing subject. As sociology deals with human beings, their identities are ones that are primal. The standpoint perspective enables the researcher to get off his high horse. Okay, so here you understand that the people whom you are dealing with, the people whom you are studying, okay, they have their own subjectivities, they experience social reality differently. Okay, and you as a researcher, you need to be extremely sensitive to understand the world of the subject through their own views. Okay, so the kind of a social and cultural and political milieu in which these people live, or in these people are situated, are something so important that provide them with a kind of a specific understanding and experience of the social reality. So the standpoint perspective enables the researcher to get off his high horse and approach the field as a learner willing to listen more than assume realities. Standpoint theories are critical of positivist social science, as it tends to adopt a hierarchical approach, with the researcher transmitting knowledge to his respondents in a rather Orientalist fashion. And the positivism has been criticized very rigorously, because it believes in an infallibility of a scientific paradigm, scientific knowledge, and it understands that the researcher has the ability to come to very objective and true reality, truth about how people live, and the people's own perspective is seen as a kind of a less credible or less worthy. Women response must be seen, it argues, not only objects of positivist inquiry, but as partners in social research. The approach was subjectively and consciously and conscious partiality rather than value neutrality. So the approach was of subjectivity and conscious partiality rather than value neutrality. Now this again is a very interesting long drawn debate about how whether sociology is an objective science, whether it can claim to be objective. I hope you remember the Weberian intervention about objectively studying subjective values, though he was critical of the early positivist position. But here it takes a very clear position that sociology cannot claim to be a truly objective position. Rather, it is deliberately partial towards women, or it is deliberately partial towards subjugated people. Okay, it does not claim to be neutral and treating everybody equal, because treating everybody equal amounts to mostly taking side with the dominant group. That's how it works in most of the social settings. So they are deliberately partial towards the dominated group, because their own experiences need to be further theorized to understand the way in which they live. Dorothy Smith and other standpoint feminists have adopted the Marxian vision, in which science can reflect upon the way the world is, and work towards human emancipation. For Marxists, it was through struggles in the workplace that the proletariat would generate knowledge. However, in mainstream Marxism, women never seem to be part of the proletariat in any explicit manner. Women's emotional or reproductive labor was rendered invisible, as were women's roles as social agents in the production of knowledge. And the amount of feminist criticism on certain crude versions of Marxism or even classical Marxism is something very remarkable, because gender was not a concern of the early of Marx himself to a large extent, and to the subsequent Marxists. Standpoint feminism sees women as the agents of knowledge. Women's experience become resources for a social analysis, and it is women who should be able to reveal what women's experience really are. In the 70s and 80s, men doing gender studies was not a common phenomenon, and it is quite heartening that in the contemporary world, standpoint feminism has moved into consciously doing gender studies with research on masculinity and men doing feminism. So that kind of a transformation is something important. The subjugated gender cannot be seen as part of a binary opposition with the other gender, but it should be seen, as Smith insists, within the relations of ruling of particular context. So this is talking about how there are structural inequalities in a particular setting, and how it has to be seen as how that structure constitutes certain kind of relations of ruling. The concept of relations of ruling focuses our attention on forms of knowledge, organized social institutions and practices, and questions of agency, consciousness, and experience, and how these structural arrangement, by default would promote and protect certain interests at the cost of others. This perspective deters analysis of gender from positing the universal standpoint of women as opposed to that of the men, and allow them to recognize that there are multiple standpoints located in the intersections of caste, class, race, gender, and religion. There are therefore standpoints of women that are particular to their specific context and experience. And this is again something that we discussed. By 1980s, there was a realization that the feminist scholarship needs to take cognizance of the myriad diversity of the women whom they are talking about. As I was telling you in the previous class, the whole project of creating a universal sisterhood seemed to be impossible, because the women's own experiences are very, very different. So based on all these things, women share certain experiences as women because men in all cultures assign certain otherness to them. Women, however, are differentiated along the lines of caste, race, class, and religion, and might find more similarities with men in their respective social relations rather than the women of other group. Okay, so you can just easily understand that the women from an upper class, elite background, and women from a lower caste and lower class, category, their concerns would be very, very different. Their lived experience would be very, very different. The way in which they navigate the life would be very, very different. So despite the fact that both of them are women, the parameters of caste, class, and social position, privilege, status, all these things render their lives entirely different. Recognizing this aspect of difference, standpoint feminists do not propagate some kind of feminine essentialism, which assumes that all women share common experience. So this again is a very interesting one, because at least there are some feminist strand which tend to portray that every woman has certain kind of essential qualities, say like caring or affectionate, emotional. So these were seen as kind of nurturing. So these are seen kind of essentially feminine qualities that only women can have, as opposed to that of men. Okay, and Aparna makes a reference about Vandana Shiva, who is a very important proponent of such kind of a position, very, very critically. Okay, because Vandana Shiva is a scholar in the field of ecology. So many of her arguments tend to present that the women are better capable of protecting the nature, because by very nature they nurture. Okay, they are more caring, they are more affectionate. So those kind of arguments are seen as kind of an over-romanticized versions of certain kind of essentialism, which many sociologists do not kind of agree with that. As scholars such as Mohanty argued, for alliances to be forged between women of color, the universal sisterhood theme that had informed the earlier empiricist phase had to be fade from feminist inquiry, especially in the Indian context. The standpoint perspective has also been critiqued by black feminist sociologist Collins for privileging experience of the white middle class woman. So we mentioned that how the liberal feminism was, though it was presented as a version of the whole women of the whole world, but later it was turned out to be that it is nothing but which is standing for the white middle class urban woman in the West. She drew our attention to the marginality by race and class as well. So it is familiar. So in the subsequent paragraphs, she puts out certain kind of examples from Indian academia, Indian scholarship, how certain attempts were made in this thing. For example, she talks about Urvashi Bhutalia's contribution based on oral histories. In fact, the publication house that was set up by Bhutalia and Ritu Menon in the 1980s, Kali for Women. It's a very, very important publishing house which published quite a lot of very important work on women's scenario in India. Okay, without going for some of these very celebrated publishing houses. So this was set up as an exclusion, as a very, very, very important platform for young Indian for the Indian women scholars to talk about the women's issues. And later sister organization Suban publication, again the same thing. So there is another reference about women's studies in India from standpoint perspectives include Susi Tharu and Lalita. This was a massive exercise to unearth poetry, fiction, drama and autobiographies written by women in 11 different languages spanning 2000 years and offer them to readers in English. Then, of course, the work by Sharmila Rege, her work on Dalit women's struggles and resistance in Maharashtra, rigorously interrogated and attempted to transform sociological analysis in India. And we could very confidently say that Sharmila Rege was one of the very important, very important scholar who made very important interventions in this field. So for Rege, her classroom was her political space and her text was literally weapons of the weak. Her critical and in-depth analysis showed that the caste and gender cannot be privileged over class, but in fact intersects each other in complex ways. Her methodology of doing research among Dalits, particularly women, are reflected in recent debates between Guru and Charukhe. So we are going to take up that essay in the coming class. Her work on feminist standpoint will be discussed in the class. Now, the third point what she highlights is the feminist postmodernism and intersectionality. So feminist postmodernism goes further than standpoint feminism in tackling questions of difference. Postmodernism challenges the claims of universalism of any sort, including feminism. Postmodernists and feminists share a skepticism towards any universalizing claims regarding the existence, nature and power of reason, progress, science, language and the subject self. Okay, so this is a very complex terrain where any sort of universality, universal framework, universal slogans, universal ideas are deconstructed and then rendered impossible. So the ideas of the kind of emancipatory potentials of reason, progress, science, all these things are critiqued very vehemently. It is suggested that multiple differences be taken into account in theorizing without privileging anyone, gender or race or class, over the others. Okay, but one of the problems that standpoint feminists and others have with postmodernism is that as we get caught up in postulating endless difference, gender loses its centrality. This is again, of course, this is one of the major criticism against the postmodern scholarship, because it is preoccupied with difference. Okay, and it is preoccupied with creating more and more sub-identities or alternative identities at the end. Okay, there is no end to that. Okay, because if you keep on fragmenting, because you say that women do not constitute a homogeneous one, so you talk about Dalit women. Okay, you say that Dalit women's experience is different, but again Dalit women themselves do not constitute a singular category. You fragment it. You look into subcaste questions, and within subcaste again a group of women who belong to a particular subcaste need not experience the kind of a similar situation. Then you bring in class, you bring in regional differences. So at the end of the day, what you will have is an endless list of differences or an endless list of sub-identities which is incapable of mounting a concerted political fight. Okay, so the politics is lost. The potential to forge alliance and then come united under certain slogans against very powerful say entities like patriarchy or state is lost in its preoccupation with creating innumerous numbers of fragmented identities and difference. And this is a very, very important criticism. So, but yeah, some feminists have viewed this development coming at a moment when feminist theory was just beginning to get accepted in the mainstream academia as potentially damaging to the feminist politics. Spivak showed how even the subaltern articulations how marginalized women. In the Indian context, for instance, the 1900s and early 20th century were periods when the caste lens became more important axis of empirical investigation and gender was either subsumed or taken for granted in the politically engaged scholarship. However, concurrently, there has been intellectual contributions that reiterate the centrality of gender as an axis of subordination. The intersectional approach combined the multiple standpoint perspectives with the importance of social location. The earlier work on endangered labors within the subfield of migration and diasporic studies almost completely erased the presence of female endangered labors. The plantation worker was male and often black, but gender became an axis of marginality only later. Now, Tejaswini Niranjana's work in the diaspora in the Caribbean is given an example. And then similarly, that of Kalpana Kanabiran's work brings together the interdisciplinary perspectives on women and law with a focus on women's rights in legal, social and economic institutions. Lawyers working, yeah. So now with globalization and trajectories of migration, women workers and dependent migrants becomes the focus of feminist scholarship. Now she talks about Margaret Abraham's sociological work, focuses on the role of coalitions in lobbying to provide better legal protection for abused immigrant women. So basically the argument is, while postmodernism quarrels with the tyranny of labels, the scholars have realized that giving away the category of gender is suicidal, because giving away the category of gender would take away the kind of a potential for any kind of politics from that category. And if you are completely engrossed and engulfed with the idea of differences and then how a difference is produced, then at the end it becomes kind of an empty exercise. So thus, in order to do sociological research that is gender sensitive and meaningful, one needs to adopt appropriate methods of sociological inquiry to suit the needs of the research question. The goal is to make visible something that is invisible and to consciously move the margins to the center. The so-called trivial has to be made important. For instance, women's interpretation of other women and their conversation that were hitherto written as gossip by androcentric scholarship have now become important research material. So the latter part of this essay, she provides similar kind of examples in that. Now, feminist ethnography normally consists of three goals: to document the activities of and lives of women, to understand and present women's experience from their own viewpoints, and to interpret women's behavior as an expression of their particular social context. Okay, Reinhardt. Feminist fieldwork is similar to other kind of fieldwork that entails active involvement of the researcher in the production of social knowledge through direct participation in the activities he is attempting to comprehend. However, feminist fieldworkers find the necessity of continuously and reflexively attending to the significance of gender as a basic feature of understanding the social realities of men and women. In the early days, feminist researchers believed in giving voice to the experiential realities of women, especially from the marginalized or subaltern sections. The researcher is herself is gendered being, and a reflexive approach allows for a greater empathy with the respondents. There is a move away from the rigidity of the scientific temper to a more open approach. So this is yet another very important contribution that the feminist framework has brought in, because it tells you that you as a researcher is also a human being coming from certain specific locations, and that reflexivity is not only about the subjects which you are going to study, but also you as a researcher. Now, this is a discussion about reflexivity. Early works in language studies have been critiqued by feminist scholars by looking at the use of sexist language and the complete erasure of not just the female subject but of the derogatory ways in which abuse in many languages in the world is directed at women. This led sociologists of education also to critically examine textbooks and gender stereotypes perpetuated in the theme as well as gender language. In the contemporary academic world, it is feminist work that has recognized diversity and scored well at representation. Feminist scholars have worked with the subaltern studies, community studies, Dalit and tribal studies to be able to provide a holistic understanding that enable on the ongoing critique of androcentric scholarship. And she invokes Anandi's work among the caste panchayats in her work among the Dalits in Tamil Nadu. Yeah. Now, again, this part talks about how the research, feminist research methodology actually has entered into new terrain with the arrival of digital forms, with the arrival of, say, Facebook, Twitter, or YouTube, or various YouTube platforms, which actually provide you with the opportunity to access to women, which were hitherto was not kind of available. Yeah. So this section I am not going into that. Self-reflexivity, lessons from research on women in the Indian diaspora. This is the author's own reflection about her own experience of having done fieldwork among the Indian diaspora communities in Pittsburgh. That was her PhD thesis. So it's an interesting discussion on that, but I'm not going into that, though it is valuable due to the paucity of time. I'm not entering into that. Okay, so this it's again not too much. I would urge you to read it, but need not be discussed in this particular class. So this essay was something important because it brought in a lot of importance. It talked about the specific contributions of feminist methodology and how it actually complicates social science research in general and sociological research in particular. It also brings in lot more different kinds of moralities and ethics in the process of research. Being an anti-positivist in character also asks the researcher to be more humble and more sensitive and more open-minded and more reflexive about her own life as well as that of the life that the researcher is planning to study. Okay, so let me stop here and we will meet for the coming class. Thank you.